Hi everybody and welcome to this, the second in our series of technical webinars. Today we're going to be looking at data locks or DLOCKs for short. And this session is aimed primarily for training providers and employer providers, but other employers may find this information useful as well. My name's Nick Duff from the Service Engagement team, and I'll be doing the hosting for today's session. So because we're going to be covering a lot of ground today, and you might want to refer back to the content after the session, we're going to be giving you access to a copy of the slides, and I'll let you know how you can get hold of those at the end of the session. We're also recording today's session, so you'll be able to access a recording on both the webinar platform where you registered for today, but also we'll give you, it'll also go to our YouTube channel, and I'll tell you how you can get access to both of those recordings near the end of the session. You could also then get colleagues to listen into the recording as well if they need to. I'm joined by Sean Farlow and Henry Morgan, who are the application support specialists on the Apprenticeship Service, and they're going to be doing the actual delivery for our session today. And then I've got a couple of extra colleagues who we can call on during the Q&A session. So we've got Sam Miller, who's the Senior Business Solutions Lead on the Apprenticeship Service, Niall Geraghty, who's the Operations Manager on the Apprenticeship Service, and finally we've also got Duncan Wannell, who's our in-year calculations Senior Manager. So welcome to all of you guys. The session will last around 60 minutes, which will include the Q&A session, although if we get lots of questions, I may steal just a few extra minutes at the end so that we can cover off as many of those as possible. And then if you can please limit your questions to questions that are covered by the topic of today's session. If we get any questions that aren't related to today's topic or are specific to an account or a specific apprentice or ULN, we won't go through those types of questions. And for those, I would suggest that you contact the support desk, and I'll share the support desk contact details towards the end of the webinar as well. Okay, if we don't manage to cover everything in the Q&A session today, we will commit to taking those unanswered questions away, and what we'll do is we'll get an answer for you and we'll send those out to everybody that attended today's session, and we're aiming to do that within a fortnight of today's session. Okay, so that's me finished, so I'll hand over to Sean. Sean, you're up first, so are you ready to go through the slides for us?
Hi Nick, yes, thanks, yeah, I'm ready. So to start us off today on our data lock webinar, I just wanted to have a little look at what is a data lock. Some of you may already know this, but we do get some questions from time to time where providers are expecting to see a data lock, but there isn't one. So I thought it would be worthwhile just touching on this for a second, would be useful. So the data lock process is a mechanism that we use to prevent an earning or earnings being paid to a training provider where there's a discrepancy between the data a training provider has recorded in their ILR and the employer's data on the Apprenticeship Service. A data lock will not trigger if there are no earnings being generated. So one example of that is if a learner is on a break in learning and you record a price change in your ILR. This won't trigger a DLOCK 7 because there's no earnings being generated while a learner is on a break in learning. Another example, and we do see this one quite often, is a price change being recorded after the planned end date but before the achievement. So effectively, once the planned end date has passed, there are no more on-program earnings until the achievement is recorded, which then triggers the completion earning. So recording a price change in that period between the planned end date and the achievement, again, won't trigger a DLOCK 7 price change. You would have to wait until the achievement's recorded to trigger that completion earning, and then the DLOCK would trigger at that point. Any data locks that aren't resolved by R14 essentially means that whatever earnings are blocked by those data locks are unfortunately lost. And lastly, data locks do not claw back any funding. Next slide, please. So this slide is kind of quite self-explanatory. It just lists the various data locks, the codes, and the descriptions that you would see in your data match reports. Next slide, please. Okay, so the data lock process is effectively a matching process that we run against each learner in an ILR to attempt to match the data from the ILR against the records on the apprenticeship service. Okay, and there's several steps to this process, and we run them in a particular order to attempt to identify the employer's record which matches the ILR data. If we find a complete successful match, there are no data locks for that learner. And obviously, if we can't find a match, this is where data locks would be triggered. Okay, so this slide shows the order of those steps. The first 4 steps that we carry out are the DLock 2, the DLock 1, the DLock 9, and then the DLock 10. And those 4 steps combined are essentially, have we got a record for this particular ULN and UKPRN where the dates line up and the employer's record is not stopped? So those first 4 steps, you can only ever get one data lock out of those first 4. If one of them is triggered, we effectively stop processing that learner any further, and we move on to the next learner in the ILR. So for example, if a DLock 1 is triggered, you can't then get any of the other data locks for that ULN. Once we've performed those first 4 steps sequentially, we then check the ones on the bottom of that slide simultaneously. So effectively, you could get several of those data locks for a particular learner. Okay, so the first step in the matching process is to take the ULN alone from the ILR and search for a record on the Apprenticeship Service for that ULN, and that is across any provider. So at this point, we're not looking at specific providers at this point. We're simply saying, is there a record on the Apprenticeship Service for that particular ULN? And on the example on this slide, we can see that the provider has submitted their ILR and has a learner with ULN 1, 2, 3. And when we look in the records on the Apprenticeship Service below it, there is no record for that ULN 1, 2, 3. So this would trigger the DLock 2. Okay, so having passed step 1, i.e. we found a record or multiple records on the Apprenticeship Service for that ULN, then step 2 is to then check if any of those records match the UKPRN. So again, looking at the slide, the ILR is for provider 1002. The record on the Apprenticeship Service that we matched to in the previous ULN step is actually for provider 1001. Therefore, there is no match on UKPRN, and so this would trigger the DLock 1. Okay, so once we've established that we have one or more records on the Apprenticeship Service which match the ILR based on ULN and UKPRN, so that is they've passed the DLock 2 and they've passed the DLock 1 step, then step 3 in this process is to match on dates. I think it's important that you understand and grasp this step, because this step is essentially how we identify the record or group of records that we're then going to look at further in the following steps when we look at trying to match on course and cost. Okay, so just to be clear, at this point, we're not looking at course and cost, we're just looking at dates. And just to explain the dates that we're matching on here, the TMP date in the provider's ILR is effectively the date that the provider is attempting to claim funding from. Okay, the start date on the employer's apprenticeship service record is the month in which the employer has agreed to start funding that apprenticeship. So here we're looking for any records where the TNP date from the ILR is in the same month or after the month on the apprenticeship service records. So just to look at the data on the slides, at the top we've got the data from the provider's ILR. They have a TNP date of the 10th of May 2020. So they are attempting to claim funding from May 2020. Okay, example 1 shows that when we matched on UK PRN and ULN, we found one single record. The start date on that record is September 2020. And so this is effectively a no match and would trigger a DLOCK 9. Okay, example 2 shows that when we matched on UK PRN and ULN, we found multiple records, but again the employer has not agreed to start funding until September 2020 for the one and April 2021 for the other, and again this is a no match and would trigger a DLOCK 9. Okay, we don't tend to see the second one of those examples. Pretty much all of the DLOCK 9s are where there is a single record, but I did want to include that because logically it is possible. Okay, so just to recap, a DLOCK 9 means that we have a number of records on the apprenticeship service for that particular UK PRN and ULN, but they all start after the month in which the provider is starting to claim funding. Okay, next slide, please. A couple more examples of what we might see when we match on dates. So in example 3 here, there is one record that matches. The TMP date of May 2020 is after or equal to the start date of October 2019. There is one record then that doesn't match. Likewise, in example 4, there are 2 records that match, i.e. the TMP of May 2020 is after or equal to both October 19 and May 2020, and then we've got that one that doesn't match. So in both of these examples, the no match records are eliminated from kind of carrying on in this matching process. The match records highlighted in yellow and green on those 2 examples are then taken forwards and evaluated further in step 4. Okay, it's worth me pointing something out here. I don't know whether any of you noticed this. If we go back to the previous slide for a moment. Okay, in example 1, here we had a single record that matched on UK PRN and ULN with a start date of September 2020, which triggered a DLOCK 9. We'll now come back to that slide, Jazz. So in examples 3 and 4 here, we've got that same record with the start date of September 2020, but because we also have other records which match on this date process, you won't get the DLOCK 9 against that September 2020 record. Instead, as I say, those no match records are eliminated going forwards, and the match records are evaluated further in step 4. Okay, next slide. Yep. Okay, so now we've seen how we match the ILR's TNP dates to the start dates on the Apprenticeship Service to effectively find records for further evaluation. So the next thing we check here in step 4 is the status of the records to see whether they are live or stopped. We've got 2 examples here. For both of these, we're using the single record that we matched to in example 3 in the previous step. So that was the one that was coloured in yellow on the previous slide, is the one that we're looking at here. So example 1 in the middle of the slide shows that the record is stopped, and so that would trigger a DLOCK 10. Okay. Example 2 at the bottom of the slide shows that the record is live. Okay, and so that record is then carried forward. We don't get a DLOCK 10 against that. That record is carried forward and evaluated further in the next step, step 5. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so 3 more examples here, and for these, we're using the multiple records that we matched to in step 3. So that was the one from a few slides back that were coloured in green. They're the records with October 2019 and May 2020 dates. In example 3, both records that we matched to in step 3 are stopped by the employers, and so this would trigger a DLOCK 10. In example 4, one of them is stopped and another one is live. So the stopped record is eliminated. The live record is then taken forwards into step 5 for further evaluation. And in example 5 at the bottom there, one of them is completed and the other is stopped. Again, the stopped record is eliminated. The completed record is taken forwards into step 5 for further evaluation. So as a bit of a summary for this step, if all of the records that we match to in step 3 are stopped, whether that's one single record or multiple records, if they are all stopped, this will trigger a DLOCK 10. If there are any records that are not stopped, so that means live, paused, completed, then you don't get a DLOCK 10, and instead those non-stopped records are evaluated further in step 5. Okay, whilst we're talking about DLOCK 10, it's worth mentioning that this is the only data lock which may not necessarily be blocking any earnings from being paid. There are effectively 2 types of DLOCK 10. The first is where there is an earning, but it cannot be paid because the employer's record is stopped. Okay. The second is where an earning has already been paid, and then the employer has subsequently stopped the record with a stop date that is before something that's been paid. So a couple of examples here. So let's say an employer's record is live, the learner is in the ILR, recorded as being in learning, earnings are being generated and they're being paid. Okay, the employer then stops the record on the Apprenticeship Service, and let's say, for example, they apply a stop date of October 22, which suggests that their last month for paying the provider would be September. If the learner remains in learning in the ILR, earnings are obviously being generated for October and later, then these earnings will be blocked by a DLOCK 10. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so example 2, the other type of DLOCK 10, and let's start with that same scenario. So we've got an employer's record who's live on the Apprenticeship Service. The ILR is recorded as being in learning, earnings are being generated and are being paid. Okay, the provider, for this example, let's say the provider records a withdrawal as at the 10th of October 22. That means that no earnings will be generated for the month of October because it's not a full month, but earnings would have been generated and paid for that month prior to that, so August and September. Yeah, the employer then applies a stop to the apprenticeship service record with a date of September. So this is effectively saying that the employer's last month of responsibility would have been August, and so the provider would receive a DLOCK 10 to effectively say that they are not entitled to the payment that they have already received for September. Okay, so that's just an explanation of the two types of DLOCK 10 there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's just recap on the steps that we've looked at so far. So far we've covered step 1, which was the DLOCK 2, which was the match on ULN. Step 2 in the process was the DLOCK 1, which was to match on UK PRN. Step 3 was the DLOCK 9, which was to eliminate any records where the start date on the employer's record is after the TMP date. And step 4 was the DLOCK 10, which was to eliminate any records where the employer has applied a stop. Okay, so we're now at step 5 in this data matching process. And given those previous 4 steps, we now know that the records that we're looking at on the apprenticeship service, and we're attempting to match to the ILR, so we know that those records are the correct ULN, the correct UK PRN, the start date on the record on the apprenticeship service is in or before the TMP start date, and the record is not stopped. So that's the kind of criteria for the records that we're now looking at in this step 5. Okay, so step 5 is essentially to look at the course and the cost. So let's start by looking at the course. We've effectively got 4 course data locks. We've got the DLOCK 3, which is a mismatch on the standard code. The DLOCK 4 is a mismatch on the framework code. The DLOCK 5, a mismatch on the program type. And the DLOCK 6 is a mismatch on the pathway code. And we evaluate all of these at the same time in this step 5. Okay, so let's have a look at the slide. At the top, we can see that the provider's ILR has a program type of 25 and the standard code is 196. And looking at the example 1, we can see we've got a match on program type 25, but we have a mismatch on the standard code. Yeah, the ILR has 196, but the training code on the apprenticeship service record that we're looking at is 175. So this mismatch on training code would trigger a DLOCK 3. So another example here, at the top, we can see that the provider's ILR has a framework code of 521, program type 2, and pathway code 2. And looking at example 2 there, we can see that we have a match on the framework code and the program type, but there is a mismatch on the pathway code. Okay, so this would trigger a DLOCK 6. Okay, so there we saw a mismatch on the standard code, the DLOCK 3, and a mismatch on the pathway code, the DLOCK 6. Okay, I'm not going to show the DLOCK 4 and DLOCK 5 individually, but what I would like to show and explain to you is something that we see quite often, quite a few providers doing wrong, which either causes an unnecessary DLOCK 10, an unnecessary DLOCK 7, or an unnecessary suite of DLOCK 3, 4, 5, 6. And I wanted to explain why this happens so that hopefully you understand this and can prevent it going forward. Essentially, the cause of these is because providers submit data in their ILR before the corresponding records that they're intended to match to are in place on the apprenticeship service. So the first example is a change of employer being recorded in the ILR before the new employer's record is in place on the apprenticeship service. Okay, so let's look at this slide. So in the ILR submission, the provider has the original TNP1 and TNP2 dated the 10th of May 2020, and that's from when the apprenticeship started at a cost of £10,000. There's then been a change of employer in June 21, and the provider has recorded a TNP3 and TNP4 dated the 15th of June with the remaining cost of £6,000. Okay, when we look at the records on the apprenticeship service for this UK PRN and ULN, we only have the original employer's record. The new employer's record hasn't been created yet. And if we think back to step 3, where we did the date matching, both of those TNP dates, so May 2020 and June 21, would match to the first employer's record, because May 2020 and June 21 are after the start date on that first employer's record. In example 1, where we check the status of the record in step 4, it's the only record and is stopped, so would trigger a DLOCK 10. In example 2, this would pass step 4 as the record is live, but would then trigger a DLOCK 7 because the £6,000, which is intended for the second employer, doesn't match the 10,000 of that first employer. Okay, so as soon as the new employer's record is in place, that TNP dated June 21 would match to the new employer's record and would resolve the DLOCK 10 or DLOCK 7. Okay, next slide. So the second example is where we see an apprentice progression from one apprenticeship to the next. Let's, for example, a level 2 to a level 3, but the level 3 apprenticeship record, so the level 3 apprenticeship is recorded in the ILR before the level 3 record is in place on the apprenticeship service. Okay, so let's look at this slide. So in the ILR submission, the provider has 2 learning aims. The first is for a framework 52122 that started on the 10th of May 2020. Then the apprentices just completed that. The second learning aim is for a new apprenticeship, standard code 196, that the apprentices just started on the 15th of June. And when we look at the records on the apprenticeship service for this UK PRN and ULN, we only have the record for the first framework. The record for the new apprenticeship hasn't been set up yet. And again, if we think back to step 3, where we did that date matching, both of those learning aims would match to the first employer's record. And that's because May 2020 and June 2021 are after the start date on that first employer's record. Okay, this would then trigger a DLOCK 3, DLOCK 4, DLOCK 5 and DLOCK 6 because there is a mismatch on the standard code, the program type, the framework code and the pathway code. As soon as that new record is created on the service for that standard code 196, then all of those data locks are resolved. Okay, so I would try and suggest that you ensure that employers' records are in place and approved before submitting data in your ILR, especially around change of employer and apprenticeship progressions. I'd probably go as far to say that without the employer's record being in place, there's no commitment that you as a training provider will actually be paid for delivering the training. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on from those course mismatch slides, let's look at the price mismatch, the DLOCK 7. Okay, so there's 2 types of DLOCK 7 and we'll have a look at both of these. The first is what I would probably call genuine DLOCK 7. And this is where a provider is genuinely wanting to change the price for an apprenticeship and it needs to be approved by the employer. Okay. The second is what I would maybe call a non-genuine DLOCK 7. And this is a price mismatch caused by modifying TNP records in a way which is not allowed and effectively breaks the system. Okay, so let's have a look at a genuine DLOCK 7. So on this slide, we've got the steps here that would take place when there is a genuine price change. Okay, so number one, the provider correctly records a price change in their ILR and submits their ILR to the Submit Learner Data website. During that step 5 of the matching process, which is course and cost matching, we would detect that the price in the ILR differs to the price on the Apprenticeship Service record that we have matched to. And again, I'll stress here, bear in mind how we matched based on dates in step 3 to then give us that group of records that we evaluate for course and cost. Also bear in mind what I mentioned about submitting data in your ILR before the corresponding record is in place. Otherwise, you could be causing a price mismatch against a record on the Apprenticeship Service that you're not intending. Okay, so step 3 in this genuine DLOCK process is that the provider passes that price change over to the employer for approval. Number 4, the employer approves that price change. And then lastly, when the next ILR is submitted by the provider, the DLOCK 7 is cleared. Okay, so that's the normal business process, if you like, for an intended price change. It's worth mentioning here a question that we see from time to time on incidents, and it's where a provider has passed a mismatch over to the employer for approval, but the mismatch seems to have bounced back to the provider again. This actually is by design. And the reason for this is that in between step 3 and step 4 on those slides, the provider submits another ILR. So effectively, the price mismatch has been passed to the employer for approval, but before the employer's got round to approving it, the provider has submitted another ILR. And in this instance, that price mismatch will always come back to the provider and they'll have to pass it to the employer again. This does mean that if you are a provider who submits several ILRs during the submission window and your employers are typically ones who don't access the system very often, then it may seem as though the mismatches are kind of bouncing back. And in this instance, it might just be a good idea to make contact with the employer to let them know that there is a mismatch to approve. Okay, so just looking at TNP records here, we've got kind of 2 golden rules when working with TNP records, which if you kind of follow these golden rules, you should avoid those kind of non-genuine DLOCKs. The first is never modify TNP records which are dated in a previous funding year, and the funding year being the 1st of August to the 31st of July. And then when adding new TNP records, the date of those TNP records must fall within the current funding year. So 2 golden rules there to stick to when working with TNP records. Okay, so genuine DLOCK 7 is where there is a real requirement to change the cost of the apprenticeship. There could be a number of reasons for this. Maybe it's discovered that the original price that was agreed between the employer and provider is found to be incorrect and needs correcting. Maybe the EPA cost that was originally recorded in the ILR at the outset has increased, meaning that the overall cost of delivering the apprenticeship has increased. And the way that this should be recorded is that the original TNP records should be left untouched, and new TNP records should always be added to reflect that new cost. Okay, so in the above example, we have agreed with the employer that the EPA cost has increased from £5,000 to £6,000, and therefore the overall cost has increased from 15,000 to 16,000. Okay, so what we do here is we leave the original TMP1 and TMP2 records as they were, and we add a new TMP record for the 6,000. That would then cause the mismatch, which would be passed to the employer for approval. Okay, so last few slides here are on looking at what I would call the non-genuine DLOCK 7. And as I said, this is effectively where one of those two golden rules that I mentioned have been broken. This slide kind of demonstrates how the apprenticeship service works when we come to move from one funding year to another. And if you can understand this, then hopefully you'll appreciate why breaking those few rules causes issues. Okay, so on the 1st of August every year, the service in effect takes a snapshot of every apprenticeship to determine the value that is remaining for that apprenticeship. So this slide has an example apprenticeship here with an agreed cost at the start of 15,000. You can see the TMP1 and TMP2 at the top left. During 1920 funding year, there are 3 earnings of £500 for May, June and July, totaling 1,500. So therefore, at the start of the 2021 year, on the 1st of August 2020, our system knows that there is a balance remaining of 13,500. Okay, and then during that 2021 funding year, there are then 12 more earnings of £500 for the whole year. So that's August 2020 all the way through to July 2021. So that's a total of £6,000 in that year. So therefore, at the start of the 21-22 year, on the 1st of August 2021, our system knows that the balance remaining at that point is 7,500. So once we're in the 21-22 year, we can't change the prices on those TMP records that were dated May 2020. And if we do, you know, if the system no longer understands what the balance remaining was at the start of that 21-22 year, because those TMP records that from the previous year have been modified. Okay, so a little bit more on that non-genuine DLOCK 7. This slide here, on the left, we've kind of got the correct way to do it, and on the right, we've got the incorrect way, which we typically see, which causes that non-genuine DLOCK 7. So on the left, we've got 2021 funding year with an apprenticeship starting with a balance of £15,000, and we've got a single TMP1 on there. During that year, there are earnings of 1,500. So during that year, the provider wants to split that single TMP1 into a TMP1 and TMP2, and shown in green is the correct way to do this. So we leave the existing TMP1 from May 21 as it is, and we record a new TMP1 and a TMP2 for those new costs. So we can see the original TMP1, which we untouched, had got 15,000. We then recorded a new TMP1 for 10 and a TMP2 for 5,000. So we don't modify that a record from 2021. Over on the right, we can see that in the 2021 year, the provider has modified the TMP1 record dated May 2021, and they've simply just reduced the cost from 15,000 to 10,000 and added a TMP2, which is also dated in a previous funding year. And by doing this, you break that snapshot that was taken on the 1st of August, and the service no longer understands what that opening balance was, and so triggers the DLOCK 7. And just at the very bottom on the right of that slide, we do get a lot of incidents raised from providers querying a DLOCK 7 where the ILR price and the AS price match, as shown on there. and the price episode start date is always kind of shown as the 1st of August. That's an indication that you've kind of broken one of those rules and caused one of these non-genuine DLOCK 7s. And effectively, to resolve this, you would need to re-add your TMP1 and your TMP2 with a date of the 1st of August in the current funding year. Okay, so that's the end of kind of my main presentation. I'll hand you over to Henry just to run through some tips on resolving data locks.
Hello everyone. We are reaching the end of the presentation now. Only a few more slides to cover. This one is on DLOCK 12. DLOCK 12 means that a learner's record in the ILR that you're trying to claim funding for has been matched to a record on the Apprenticeship Service based on ULN, UKPRN and date, and that record has been paused by the employer. The pause function in the Apprenticeship Service is quite a blunt tool. It's just a button. You just press pause or unpause. You don't enter a date for that pause. The employer doesn't, I mean. To solve a DLOCK 12, where you've got an where you're not getting paid for a certain period of time, the employer would need to remove the pause and re-add. And that can obviously happen if the employer applies the pause a bit too more quickly than you've had a chance to claim all of your funding, which can happen. As we've said in previous webinars, pauses related to breaks in learning are not mandatory in the Apprenticeship Service. The employer does not have to apply a pause. It's designed to give them some security that you're not overclaiming, but it isn't mandatory. Moving on. So this is a slide about solving data locks and editing. The first slide is about where you can and can't edit the Apprenticeship Service. So if the Apprenticeship Service is wrong, some fields in the Apprenticeship Service can be edited where there has not been a successful data match. So a successful data match means that the ILR and Apprenticeship Service have already matched and some funding has been released. Fields can be edited prior to a successful data match relating to the standard code, framework code, program type, pathway code, as well as the apprenticeship price start date. Therefore, this applies to DLOCK 3, 4, 5, 6, and 9. If there's already been a successful data match, but there is a DLOCK 3, 4, 5, 6, or 9, i.e. the Apprenticeship Service and ILR were both wrong, both entered incorrectly, and you were paid on that basis, the Apprenticeship Service record does need to be stopped back to its start date and recreated to resolve the data lock. For DLOCKs 1 and 2 related to UKPRN and ULN, if the Apprenticeship Service record has been fully approved by both the employer and the provider, then stopping back to the start date is the only solution if the Apprenticeship Service is wrong. For these two data locks, it doesn't matter whether there's been a successful data match between the Apprenticeship Service and ILR or not. Both the employer and provider have approved an incorrect record on the Apprenticeship Service, and that can't be edited. Moving on to the next slide. If the ILR is wrong, for DLOCKs 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 9, you can edit your ILR to make it match the Apprenticeship Service. For DLOCK 9, if the accurate ILR price start date, be that a TMP 1, 2, 3, or 4, is in an earlier academic year, then the solution is to also add additional prices dated the 1st of August of the academic year you're returning the data for, as the TMPs dated an earlier academic year and added the ILR for the first time in a later academic year will not be processed. So that's written in the slide there. It's a bit of a mouthful there, but that is written down for you. Moving on, this is the last slide that on the topic, and it's more of a sort of general piece of advice that we thought was worth giving. It's important to ensure that there's clear communication between staff inputting the ILR and staff who are working with the employer to get the apprenticeship service up to date. With some providers, there may be different teams that are looking at different interfaces of the service. So they're looking at the ILR or the apprenticeship service, but they're not looking at both. It's important that if there is a change to be made on either side of the service, ILR provider, or so either the ILR or the apprenticeship service, then this needs to be communicated to all parties that are involved in updating information and data. With some providers, we see that the same person or team will manage both the ILR data as well as the apprenticeship service and the relationship with the employer. This is good, as you can be aware of where all changes need to be approved, stroke actioned, and it allows you to check that data originally entered matches across the ILR and the apprenticeship service. Yeah, that is a suggestion. Okay, that's the end of the slides that we're going to deliver.
Cool. Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you very much, Henry. I'm glad you were here to give that update, and I'm glad you're here to answer the questions, because yeah, that was quite a technical topic, and it was confusing me. So yeah, well done for that. I've never been able to have gone through all of those. Okay, so we've got quite a few questions to try and get through, and we are running slightly late. So we'll try and get through as many of these questions as we can. And if you don't mind, guys, I mean, I did allude to this at the beginning. We may just go over by 5 or 10 minutes, so we can cover off as many of the questions as we can. What we will do is we'll be uploading the handouts now into the control panel. So give us a minute or two, so you can go and download a copy of the handouts. So yeah, go to the control panel. There's a section that says handouts. Go and have a look in there. They'll be there in a few minutes. But we'll go through some of the questions. Okay, so Henry, there's a question here about apprentices moving employers, and the providers often getting DLOCK errors or an ILR mismatch on the old employer. What do they do? Henry, have we lost you? Can't hear you. No sound.
Yeah, beg your pardon, sir. I was still on mute.
Right. Okay, cool.
Where there's a change of employer in the apprenticeship service, you won't get a data lock if so you have a TMP 3 and 4 to represent that change of employer. If that TMP 3 and 4 is dated, say the 15th of September, the original employer applies a stop as of September, and the new employer applies a stop as of September. So all those dates are at the same month. That avoids a data lock. Okay. That is the route one solution to that. Okay.
Stay off mute because the next question is for you as well. If a provider's got learners that are on breaks in learning, this particular provider is getting DLOCK 12 errors, can these just be ignored, or is there something they need to do?
No, I wouldn't ignore them. I would think that what's happened there is that the employer has paused the record quite quickly, and you're inputting ILRs to claim funding after that pause. That's going to generate more funding after the pause has been applied. So there's a certain amount of funding being withheld from you there. So the solution would be to ask the employer to remove the pause, wait until an ILR return has passed and you've got funding appearing on your apprenticeship monthly payment report for that learner, and then ask them to reapply the pause. Okay. As we touched on in a previous webinar, the pause isn't mandatory for a break in learning for the employer.
Okay, thank you. Sean, a couple of questions for you. Is there a reason why the DLOCK errors aren't done in sequential order?
That's a good question, Nick. Yeah, there's no reason really. That's just the way the kind of system was kind of designed and developed at the outset, really. You know, the kind of the DLOCK numbers and the descriptions were kind of set out. These are the things that we need to validate. But once the kind of system was developed, we did them in a kind of a different order, if you like.
Okay, we're not going to go back and change them now, presumably.
No.
Okay, I just thought so. Worth asking the question though. Provided here with I suppose an apprentice's status is continuing, and the planned end date is in the future. Will they get paid? So next year, when the DLOCK is going to be resolved, even if the DLOCK isn't resolved by R14 of the current funding year.
Yeah, so if the DLOCK isn't resolved by R14 of the current funding year, obviously we've got R14 coming up now in about a month's time. If the DLOCK isn't resolved, then any funding in this year that is blocked by that DLOCK, then unfortunately you will lose. Once we go into next year, you know, we've got kind of 12 months to resolve that DLOCK. So if it's data locked to R01 and R02 and R03, for example, and we solve that DLOCK in R04, then you will be paid back from R01 onwards.
Okay, thanks. Now, I did promise that I wouldn't ask questions that weren't related to today, but this one I think is quite important. So I will. Sam, if you don't mind, now that non-levy employers can backdate a month, if we're late adding learn, how does this affect the ILR return if they've not added an apprentice before the ILR run?
Yeah, so if the obviously, yeah, we've just released that feature in terms of the for small employers, non-levy employers, that we can reserve funds and add apprentices back a month as well. So if you go on now for September, you'll see them. You can add them for August. We've seen that been taken up quite a lot certainly within the first week. But yeah, if an apprentice is already in the ILR and is not on the service, or that matching record is not on the service, then in your ILR submissions you will get one of the date locks that's been mentioned throughout kind of the webinar today. As soon as that apprenticeship has been confirmed and set up on the service, whether that be after the 1 or 2 ILR submissions, and there is a matching record, then the date locks will be removed, and you should then get the funding all the way from the start of the apprenticeship when you added it on the ILR.
Cool, thanks, Henry. Students, so a number of apprentices that are mismatched on the apprenticeship service. These are where the students progress from one qualification onto another. The providers receive payments, so do they just ignore the mismatch, or is there something they need to do, or is this a help desk question?
Yeah, so in that scenario where there's a progression and the ILR is submitted before the new apprenticeship service record, that can generate a mismatch. And then when the new apprenticeship service record is added and it matches up with the ILR, the data lock that's in the data lock report on the submit learner data site, the data match report on the submit learner site, will disappear, and you'll be paid. But mismatches on the apprenticeship service, because you're not solving the mismatch on the apprenticeship service, it will linger. That is I'll call it a feature of the service. In previous years, though, those mismatches have expired after a certain point, possibly after R14. You will need to ignore mismatches where you've been paid fully. Yes.
Okay, and then Sean, can you confirm what date they're paid for a full month? So, e.g., if an apprentice leaves on the 10th of August, I know they wouldn't be paid for August, but if the date was the 27th of August, would the provider get paid as most of the month has been completed?
Okay, so it's probably worth me explaining kind of both ends of the apprenticeship, at the start as well as at the end. So at the start, you get paid for the month, even if the learner starts on the last day of the month. So if the learner starts on the 28th, you will get paid for that month, even though you've only done kind of 3 days of that month. At the end, you only get paid for a full month. So if the the end date is the 28th, for example, if there's a break in learning recorded on the 27th or 28th, then you won't receive anything for that month.
Okay, thank you. Still with you, Sean, for another couple if I can. So there's a second part of DLOCK 10. Would that mean that there'll be a payment clawback if the DLOCK wasn't resolved, i.e. If the employer doesn't change the stop date to match the ILR?
No, there wouldn't be a clawback. Data locks don't clawback funding. It just essentially means that you know, as I said in the presentation, the employer has come along and subsequently applied a stop date that is before something that you've been paid. So effectively, to resolve that data lock, you need to contact the employer and kind of discuss why they've applied a stop date that is before something that you've been paid. And if they adjust the stop date accordingly, that would then clear that DLOCK 10. But as I say, you've essentially already been paid for it and it won't be clawed back.
Okay. The next question was about DLOCK 3 progression of learners. Is that the same as what we just talked about beforehand with Henry, or is that a different question, Sean?
I think that's the same scenario, I think, that Henry went through.
Let's skip over that one then. So DLOCK 12, the next question, DLOCK 12 for Henry. Employers can't select a date to pause the record and appears as a mismatch. If DLOCK 12 had more information and any follow-up, sorry, is the DLOCK 12 more for information and follow-up, any actions required, e.g. break-in learning? Have I butchered that question?
This is kind of, I've kind of put myself down for a duplicate answer there, but the DLOCK 12 will withhold funding, so it's not just there for information, no.
Okay, cool. If an employer processes a stop in September, is that the same question again? Sorry, can
I pick that one up again, Nick?
Yeah, go on. So can I ask the question? If the employer's process stop for September, on October the 4th, for example, will the September payment process if the stop has been applied before the payment for the September processes?
Yeah, so it's probably worth saying there that the stop date that employers put on the system always kind of defaults to the 1st of the month. So if an employer stops a record with a date of October, that implies that their last month for paying the provider is September. I just wanted to clarify that because we do see that on an awful lot of tickets. And then when we run the payments process, it's based on the status of the record at that point in time. So if the record is stopped at the point in time that we run that payments process, then you would get that DLOCK 10.
Okay, I'm going to skip over a couple of questions and go to the question with DLOCK 7. So why can a price change not be made without having to trigger a DLOCK 7? This is for Henry, if you would answer this one, please. If they could, the provider could update and send to the employer for approval before the ILR submission, then the DLOCK 7 wouldn't need to be triggered.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why that's being asked, but that scenario could mean that the ILR doesn't get updated, and then you'd have different information in the ILR from the Apprenticeship Service. You'd have different earnings being calculated in the ILR, and those that wouldn't correspond with it wouldn't work effectively with the current system, which relies on the ILR and the Apprenticeship Service being the same. Okay.
DLOCK 6 then, Henry, the next question for you. If the standard code and pathway code are entered correctly in the ILR, is mandatory to select the pathway on the Apprenticeship Service. So yeah, it is mandatory to select the pathway on the Apprenticeship Service. I understand the standard in the ILR and the AS needs to match. However, I've been told that I don't need to select the pathway in AS as long as it's correct in the ILR. Is that correct? And is that...
So for an apprenticeship standard, there is only one pathway code, as I recall, and the pathway isn't entered into the Apprenticeship Service. It's a default value for a standard, I should say. Obviously, for frameworks, pathways differ, and but we don't have any new starts on frameworks now, so that would be the answer for the apprenticeship standard.
Okay, I've had a question about DLOCK 9, if I can, Henry. So DLOCK 9, where a small or non-levy employer has put the incorrect start date that is after the actual start date, how do we resolve this? And can they amend the start date in the ILR? And if so, what impact does that have?
If you've got a reservation of funds and a learner record in the apprenticeship service, obviously we've now built in the functionality to allow you to go back 1 month with a reservation and a commitment. So if the employer's got outstanding, it's got reservations available, then you could create a new reservation and commitment for the previous month, but we're only allowing you to go back 1 month. If you're a few months out of date now, the answer is, as per the funding rules, is that the ILR start date can't be before the apprenticeship service start date, because it's the employer who is reserving the funding and giving you the signal to get paid. So the ILR start date does have to be moved to be in line with the apprenticeship service start date, and you aren't allowed to claim funding for that period of time, that period of learning. So you have to reduce your price down to only. So say you did a couple of months of learning prior to the apprenticeship service start date, you can't claim, you're not permitted to claim for that either. That's what the funding rules say there.
Right. We've gone sort of way over now, 7 minutes. So there's one last question I want to ask. Duncan, it's for you if I can. Are there any known errors with DLOCK reports? The Apprenticeship Service support desk has apparently confirmed that the ILR data errors on the Apprenticeship Service are sometimes incorrect. This provider has a DLOCK 7 where the fee looks exactly the same in the Apprenticeship Service and the ILR. Is there any comment on that one?
Yeah, so I think particularly relating to that last bit, your prices can look the same superficially on the ILR and the Apprenticeship Service, but the important thing is the correct price that's being used for the data log. So I think a little bit was spoken earlier about making sure the price is recorded in the right year and things like that. If you've recorded a price change and you've recorded it in the funding year that's now closed, the calculation will ignore that price, I believe. So you need to make sure that you've recorded your TMPs correctly. It could be that while superficially they look correct, the calculation is still using a different set of prices from your ILR because you've updated them with the wrong sets of times.
Okay, thank you very much, Duncan. Okay, so we are now over. So I'll call quits on the Q&A session. Thanks everybody for submitting your questions. As I mentioned, we obviously haven't covered as many as have come through. We will get those answered for you and send you an email to everybody that's attended today so they can see those questions being answered, and we'll get that to you in a couple of weeks' time. So thanks for submitting the questions, and thanks everybody for answering as many of those as we could. That's really cool. If we moved on a slide, there we go. Excellent. So just to let you know, we've got 2 more of these sessions coming up. In the 5th of October, we've got a session on understanding payment reports, and on the 30th of November, we've got a session about recording a grade and certification. So you can register for those on the link that's on screen. That's also replicated in the handout, so you'll be able to get that from there. The webinar recordings from today will also be on that screen whilst we're running through these technical webinars, and we'll also have them on to our YouTube channel, which Jazz has just put up onto the screen for us. We've got 3 playlists currently on the DFE YouTube channel. We've got there all of the support videos covering the different functions of the Apprenticeship Service are on using the Apprenticeship Service playlist. The recordings from webinars get put onto the Apprenticeship Service webinar recordings playlist, and then there's a couple of other videos that are just general apprenticeship support videos on the apprenticeship support video playlist as well. Videos are updated and added all the time, so go and have a look at that channel, please. On to the next slide, and this is our last slide. So hopefully you've all seen the handouts now, so you've got copies of the slides, and you've also got a copy of a PDF document with the main links for information that was shared today. We've also included a link to apprenticeships.gov.uk and ESFA communities as a valuable source of both of those as a valuable source of information. The GoToWebinar link is on there as well, so you can register for any future webinars. So today's session will be uploaded onto that link by the end of the week, and the YouTube one will be within a couple of weeks. Okay, then finally, if you've got any specific queries about the apprenticeship service, and some of you did have from the questions you've asked today, can you contact the support desk? So you can either do that using the self-service support tool, or you can email them. I think many of you will have phone numbers for them as well, so please contact them, particularly with R14 coming up so close as well, and try and get those issues resolved before the hard close. So that's the end of our session today. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for those that have stayed right to the bitter end. Well done for you guys. Thanks to my panel of presenters, well, the panel with Henry and Sean as the presenters, and then Sean, Duncan and Niall as my Q&A panel. Remember, as you leave, please complete that short survey and let us know your thoughts and your feedback about today. So bye everybody, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.